This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on the early human societies and their political organizations. So when we start off with the basic organization for human beings at the beginning of time, that was hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers were groups of about 20 to 30 people. They started off in Africa and then began moving outwards. The primary reason why we think this happened is because of climate changes, such as the Ice Age that took place about 10,000 years ago. Now, in hunter-gatherer societies, there was a division of duties and was usually done by gender. Men would go out hunting, women would do most of the gathering. However, hunter-gatherer societies tended to be pretty equitable between men and women. There are a number of reasons for this. One, the societies were small. Second, the duties were not that much different at that time period. And most importantly, women at the time period were seen as representatives of sort of the goddess religions of the fertility of the earth. And that gets into the religious beliefs of hunters and gatherers. They tended to be a combination of what's known as pantheism and animism. Pantheism is the belief that there is a spirit world that exists within nature. So God is not outside of nature, God is within nature, and there isn't one God, there are multiple gods. Also, these gods tend to be represented through animal spirits. So animism is the belief that the spirit world is revealed through different animals. Now, the political leadership at that time period was broken up into what are known as tribes or clans, and that was based upon family relationships, or oftentimes it was called kin relationships. There was a chief who was in charge of these families, but he was more of a facilitator, not so much a king or a primary ruler. Decisions were based upon what is known as consensus, in which the members of all the families would come together and they would have to agree commonly upon making a decision. Now, sometimes there could be a group of elders who represented the interests of the tribe, clan, or family, but these elders would have to come to a consensus decision. They did not rule by majority, nor did they rule by having one person make all the decisions. This then changed with the early sedentary societies. The main ones that formed at the time were around river systems, which makes sense. People needed water at that time period, and they eventually used this as well for irrigation. They tended to settle around rivers like the Nile, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. They developed small villages. Those villages then grew into major cities. One of the reasons why they were able to do this was the domestication of animals, especially when we're talking about the Middle East, of the pigs, sheep, goats, cattle, and horses. That will not be true in Mesoamerica. Also, they developed horticulture, the development of mass agricultural production of cereal grains. This is another huge advancement for people in the Middle East. It allows for a population growth and a supply, an oversupply of food for people to be able to grow upon. It also began leading into a division of labor between the owners of land and the workers. So political leadership now developed off of these changes. The cities typically had a king who was then advised by religious leaders. The king was necessary in order to organize a military, both to protect from outside invaders and to protect from internal instability. Also, they managed the river systems, which provided a reason for strong leadership because of the possibility of constant flooding. The main values of these cities then became hierarchy and social stability. So notice we've moved away from that early egalitarianism between men and women and between different groups. Now that we have land ownership and the need for protection, now we're starting to see the establishment of class divisions and also a hierarchy of social roles. Now, there were some different ways to organize these kinds of systems. In Greece, the primary way was through what was called the polis, or the city. Greece formed city-states, and these were small city-states that would be run by an aristocratic representation. Now, there were differences in the way this was done. Athens did this through an aristocratic democracy, while Sparta did it through a military type of order. But in both cases, you did end up having an aristocratic democracy. In Athens, it was a little bit more widespread, although even there, only 1/3 of males who own property would be able to represent themselves. In the case of Sparta, there was also a representation system. It was done through a parliament called the Gerousia. Now, out of this, we ended up having some major philosophers who would become the foundations to Western society: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And they argued that the best way to organize a polis was a balance between all the different systems. They noticed that a dictator was a one-person rule. This could lead to the abuse of power. Democracy, according to them, was not a good system of politics, because it could lead to mob rule and the tyranny of the majority. I mean, think carefully. Socrates ends up being condemned to death by the democracy. There's also an oligarchy, rule by the rich But that could lead into a problem of distribution of wealth. So what they argue is there needs to be a mix of the forms of government in order to create a system for the common good. And so typically out of this tradition, we end up forming the belief of either a constitutional monarchy, as we're going to see in Europe, or our system that we have today, checks and balances between mixing up the different powers. However, most societies at this time period did not choose any form of democracy, nor did they choose to be organized into small cities, but rather into land-based empires. Land-based empires were an organization in which the cities would combine together, and they would form these vast, massive empires. The trade between the different villages and city-states led into these combinations. Some examples of the time period include the Mauryan in India, the Persian, the Han in China, Rome, and eventually Byzantium. These empires had different ways of ruling, but each one had some similar patterns. So what are these similar themes? All the empires had a strong hierarchy, with a monarch using the military and law to keep unity. All of them related to other countries or other cities or other villages through tributary systems in which they would go out and conquer. They would allow these smaller city-states to rule on their own as long as they paid a form of taxation to the empire itself. All of them participated in trading systems. Remember, the major ones of this time period are the Indian Ocean, Silk Roads, Mediterranean, and the Andean out in Mesoamerica. All of them eventually saw the need to expand outwards in order to solve the problems of land inequality. So here's what this means. Almost all of these land empires were based upon creating more and more of a food surplus. In order to do that, they then had to have people work on the land and create massive surplus of food. The problem with doing this is that this eventually created land inequalities. So how do you solve for that problem so you don't have internal instability? Well, you create a military that goes out and conquers more land and brings that in. That's going to create a problem for each of these societies. Expansion and how to deal with the problems that come with expansion. So some examples. Rome. Rome began as a republic with a fight over land inequalities between two groups, the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians owned the land, the plebeians worked on the land. Now eventually they tried to solve this problem by expanding their representation. They created something called the Council of the Plebs. The Council of the Plebs was meant to include more plebeians. Instead what it did was it just expanded the amount of patricians. So now you had more patricians but far more plebeians. In order to solve this problem, the generals started expanding outwards in order to gain land. And the way that the system worked in Rome, a general would have to go out and recruit people to fight in his particular army. So what generals did was they would conquer an area and promise land to the soldiers who fought for them. This led to Roman generals seizing power from one another in order to try and create power over Rome. And eventually the Roman generals were able to get the Senate to agree to hand them over emergency power, and the Roman generals then created an empire. Eventually, this overexpansion, like we talked about, would lead to a collapse and a split done by the Roman Emperor Diocletian, who tried to solve this problem by splitting Rome into two sections, Western Rome and Eastern Rome being Byzantium. So Byzantium. Rome split, like we talked about, into eastern and western sections. Byzantium then tried to expand out into North Africa, very similar to the other empires, but they failed. When they failed, they took a little bit of a different route than other empires did. They became just a trading fortress. They were located on the Dardanelles Straits, which is right by Turkey and right below the Dead Sea. And they used this as a way to protect themselves against other invasions, which worked for several centuries. And they also became incredibly wealthy because they were right on the trade routes that crossed over from Asia into Middle East and then over into Europe. The way they maintained this order was through an emperor named Justinian. Justinian established a strict hierarchy based upon the Justinian Code of Laws. Now in Mesoamerica, we see a very similar pattern happen. And what's kind of interesting about this is that during this entire time period, the Aztecs and the Incas in the south were completely isolated from Europe, yet they were going to do the exact same thing the Europeans did, and actually they did it to a far greater degree. At the time that the Europeans were creating their kingdoms, the Aztecs had a much greater and massive kingdom. The Aztecs moved into the Mexican region when the Toltecs and the Olmecs had collapsed. The Aztecs expanded and conquered neighboring tribes and then demanded tribute from them. They built a massive trade capital called Tenochtitlan, and there, even though they were in the middle of a desert, they would create these large standing irrigation systems in which they took swampy water and kind of stored it for future use, and these were called chinapas. They had a king with religious advisors, and they practiced human sacrifice. But at the local level, the people were organized into extended families called capuli. So notice here, we have very similar patterns. An empire organized locally by family and kinship, having a strong hierarchy, and then going out and expanding and conquering for land purposes and demanding tribute back in order to maintain the empire. The Incas, very similar. Incas in South America were the eventual outgrowth of a group of different Indian tribes in the south, the Mochi, the Wari, and the Tiwanaku. They expanded out into the area around the Andes Mountains, which was extremely difficult to do. The Andean Mountains are very high, very difficult land to have to rule by. Now, the way that they did this was each emperor had to conquer new lands for himself to expand the empire. Here's what this means. When an emperor came into power, he did not inherit the land from his father or his grandfather. Instead, he had to go out and conquer new lands, and those lands would then become his. By doing this, this caused an incentive for the Incan Empire to continuously grow. And then what they did was they practiced tribute with the local areas that they conquered. The Incas also were known for practicing human sacrifice as a way to organize the empire. The Persian Empire. So the largest empire in the Middle East was the Persian Empire, and they argued that the king was a messenger of their god, Ahura Mazda. They expanded outwards and ruled again by tribute, so we see that same pattern of how an empire relates to the local areas that they conquered. However, the Persians did something very different from a lot of other empires at the time. They allowed for the tolerance of local cultures and governance if those local cultures recognized the Persian monarch as having ultimate power. This eventually, though, was going to collapse when the Persians tried to conquer Greece during the wars with Athens and Sparta over the peninsula where the Ionians were in charge. Mali. The African city-states in Western Africa were organized under Sundiata. After Sundiata, Mansa Musa converted to Islam when he traveled to the Middle East. He then brought back such a massive amount of gold from the trans-Saharan trade route that he created this new trade route that would run all the way through the Saharan desert out into the Middle East. It formed a trading empire in Western Africa and connected Western Africa now out into the Middle East, allowing for the exchange of gold, the exchange of slaves, the exchange of goods and services, and most importantly, the exchange of monotheism, as we see Islam expanding out into northern Africa. Also, Mali would go out and conquer stateless societies and put them into a tributary relationship. So what do we get out of all of this with human organization at the very beginning? Humans started off living in small, relatively egalitarian societies that were largely dependent upon nature. Climate changes then forced humans out to seek out warmer areas, and that forced them into doing irrigation practices and mass agriculture to support larger social organizations. This then led into population growth, mass production, and governmental management. And notice it also began creating a lot of the systems that we see in societies from there on out. Hierarchy, division of labor, religious and cultural value systems to organize people, relationships between different societies at this time period largely dependent upon tributary relationships, and the constant need to determine how they were going to deal with land inequalities.